Good evening, everybody. We've got about 50 people here so far, which is fantastic. Although I understand we're expecting about the same number again. Before we head off to hear from Raffaella, Christina Whip-Perry from Confer and Carnac is going to say a few words. And I'll just tell you a little bit about her. She's been publishing director of Confer and Carnac since the launch of their new press in 2020. She's got over 30 years experience in the trade of academic and educational publishing across a wide range of disciplines. So, Christina.
I'm delighted to be here with you all. I'm delighted to see how many people have come to celebrate the publication of Primitive Bodily Communications in Psychotherapy. And when we do these wonderful little book launch events, I always tend to look back at my communication with, in this case, Raffaella Hilty, the editor, to see how far back it goes. And since Ruth mentioned that I've been with the press since 2020, in fact, I started writing to and communicating with Raffaella in April 2020. So she really is one of the first authors, editors that I commissioned. And it's also worth saying that it's thanks to Brett Carr that her project came to us in the first place, because I think she was in conversation with Brett about the idea even before I showed up. So I don't know how far back it goes, but certainly from my experience, the project has been well underway since April 2020, and we're delighted to actually see it in print now. This is the version that we have received so far, and I just wanted to say very briefly there was a slight error at the printer, so we've had to go and get it repaired. Therefore, the publication date is now July 4th, Independence Day in the States, instead of what we had hoped it would be, which was around the beginning of June. So apologies for that, but it will be even better when it comes off the presses the second time. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the contributors who are speaking speak tonight. And I hope you enjoy the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. I'm just going to make a few introductory comments about the book before we move on to the speakers themselves. It's such an exciting occasion when a book comes out like this. It's really like a birth after all the long labour that's gone into producing a work like that. So really huge congratulations are due specifically to Raffaella Hilty for bringing it all together. And she's gathered together an absolutely stellar array of contributors to write chapters on this most important, mysterious and fascinating topic, looking at primitive bodily communications in psychotherapy. And the volume is slightly unusual in that its authors are not chosen on the basis of coming from the same theoretical school as you'd often find. Divergent viewpoints are included, ranging from attachment-based backgrounds to TA, to psychoanalytic, to relational, and to Jungian, all of which sit alongside each other quite comfortably. And what binds the papers together is their engagement with the deep bodily symptoms and unconscious communications. Often bodily symptoms are seen as somatic expressions narrated on the canvas of the body, as Raffaella has called it in her introduction, an idea she's picked up from the chapter by Wooldridge. Traditionally, we meet the body in the work through eating disorders or self-harm and body image, as well as through bodily countertransference. More unusually, in these chapters, we also hear accounts of bodily smells and every conceivable bodily secretion entering into the consulting room. And I mean that quite literally. These matters have their roots even in the earliest accounts of psychoanalysis in the cases of both Freud and Jung. But I believe this may, in fact, be the first comprehensive account of such unconscious bodily communications. I have to say that I found myself physically recoiling at points reading this book and audibly retching. There are places where you really need a strong stomach to read this book. Sinison even suggests at one point that if you have an aversion to stories about fecal matter, you should skip over the next two vignettes in her chapter. The stories are genuinely challenging work, which is absolutely not for the faint-hearted. There's a great deal to admire there in these accounts and in the robust resilience displayed in each of the practitioners who were invited to read. And I believe this will be an important resource for us all for years to come. And so let me hand you to Raffaella, the editor of this wonderful book. Raffaella is an attachment-based psychoanalytic psychotherapist with the Bowlby Centre. She's worked as an honorary psychotherapist with the NHS for a number of years, and now is in private practice based in London. So, Raffaella.
And hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really an amazing experience to be here and to have got to this point. As Ruth said, it's like the birth of a baby, and I'm grateful to everybody who has contributed to this book and to this birth. So this book is about primitive bodily communications in psychotherapy. And I would like to start by saying something about how the idea of the book was born, which goes back to even before 2020. In fact, it all began in 2019, when I had the pleasure to organize with Confer a conference on the topic of bodily expressions in psychotherapy. Some of the clinicians who have authored the chapters of this book were at that conference. Professor Brett Carr, Dr. Valerie Sinison, David O'Driscoll, Gabriel Brown, and Mark Linington, they were all there. And I remember that by the end of the day of that conference, we were already talking about the possibility of a further collaboration in the form of an edited book. So that's how it all started. For me, it's been a real honor to work with all the brilliant practitioners who have contributed to this book. In addition to the colleagues I've just mentioned, the other contributors are Salvatore Martini, who is joining us today from Italy, and William Cornell and Tom Aldridge from the United States. Unfortunately, they could not join us today. Now, the title of the conference I've just mentioned was The Voiceless and Unheard. I think it is an important title to mention so that it highlights how often people who cannot communicate with verbal language are marginalized and have poor access to talking therapies. As psychotherapists, I believe we are all very familiar with what it means to experience emotional distress of our clients, although most of the times those intense emotions will be expressed verbally. But what about those people who cannot talk, or those individuals who can talk but carry a range of unprocessed emotions that cannot be verbally expressed? When emotional distress cannot be felt or verbalized, it becomes embodied or acted out, which means that it is expressed through the body. Now, of course, the hypothesis that bodily expressions can be found in a place of deep psychological conflicts and fantasies is not new, and it is central to psychoanalysis since its beginnings. We just need to go back to studies on hysteria, where Sigmund Freud and his colleague, Joseph Breuer, used 5 clinical cases to demonstrate the psychogenic etiology of hysterical symptoms, as they realized that the physical symptoms were the representative of the split of affects that could be talked away once verbalized and abreacted. With the development of psychoanalysis, though, this emphasis on the body was partly lost. For many years, theories of the mind became the central focus in psychoanalytic thinking, whereas the body became more and more of a secondary player to the main drama of the mind. Recently, the influence of neuroscience, as well as the new findings in attachment theory and a renewed interest in trauma theory, have brought back the attention to the body as the neurobiological matrix of the mind. But despite this renewed interest in the embodied dimension in psychotherapy, it seems to us that the most primitive ways in which the body can communicate in the consulting room are still not much talked about. This book explores the topic of bodily communication through a vast spectrum of clinical cases, also and especially those cases that are not much talked about. because probably the material can be messy and uncomfortable to be with. As Ruth mentioned before, it can evoke feelings of disgust, repulsion, and other strong countertransferential reactions. For example, some of the chapters, the author presents cases of clients who communicated through the use of bodily fluids, such as speech in saliva, urinating, smelling, and other kinds of bodily secretions. And also those chapters that discuss what we would consider more mainstream forms of bodily communication, such as eating disorders, while even there, we have a body that makes its presence very visible through uncomfortable forms of self-harm, such as induced vomiting and starvation. Often, these ways of expressing emotional distress through the body have been analogically linked to the behavior of a baby, so they've been maybe analogically thought of as baby-like. Because like in infancy, the distress cannot be communicated with words, and it is conveyed by the psyche to the body bypassing the use of language. And this takes me to the title of the book, which refers to these bodily expressions as primitive. We are aware that the use of the word primitive could evoke polarizing reactions, partly because of the negative racial connotation that has historically been associated with this word, but also because of a long-standing psychoanalytic tradition that has framed bodily expressions as regressive, infantile, and either explicitly or implicitly inferior to verbal language. Well, the book wants to challenge exactly that tradition, bringing back the body to the foreground as an equal to the mind. So the book refers to these bodily expressions as primitive, simply because they point to states of mind that are archaic, primary, and that pertain to those early stages of development where mind and soma are two ends of the spectrum of a one underlying reality. This is the archetypal layer of the psyche that in analytical tradition we call the psychoid. Developmentally, it is the territory of the earliest childhood memories and of our preverbal memories. Moreover, the book aims to highlight the important communicative aspect of these bodily expressions. In this context, the topic of countertransference, and especially of what we refer to as somatic countertransference, plays a very important role. And one chapter in the book is dedicated specifically to this topic. A lot of space in the book is given to the clinical material, because we want to shift the focus from theorizing about the embodied dimensions of the psyche to embodying its presence. Another differentiating aspect of the book, as Ruth has already mentioned before, is that it covers this topic through various theoretical orientations. This reflects the aim of the book to contribute healing also the various places in our psychoanalytic tradition, proving that the talking therapy in its various psychoanalytic orientations can still work, even when it is the body that does the talking. I will stop here, as I would like the other authors who have joined us today to talk about their own chapters. But before I do so, I would like to thank everybody who have contributed to this book. I would like to thank the authors for their enthusiasm and generosity. I want to thank Carr Books for welcoming this project, and all the people who have worked so hard to make this idea of this book become a reality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raffaella. I should just say, before we move on, that I'm asking you to hold on to your questions, if you would, until the end, and then you can address questions to any of the speakers as you wish when we get to the end. Okay, so our next speaker this evening is Brett Carr, Professor Brett Carr, who tells us that he had the pleasure of teaching Raffaella during the first year of her training at the Bowlby Centre. He's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, author, and visiting professor at Regent's University in London. Brett's also the advisory editor-in-chief of Confer and Carr Books. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Brett Carr.
Greetings to you all, and thank you to Ruth Williams for facilitating this event, and my warm appreciation to all our colleagues at Carr Books and Confer Books for bringing this very, very special volume to life in such a beautiful way. during a very difficult chapter of world history. It's a real honor for me to be able to take pleasure from the fact that I first met Raffaella Hilty, our editor and our inspirer, when she was literally in the very first week of her training. And I have to say, although I've had the privilege of working with literally thousands of some very compassionate and very impressive students over the decades, she really is in that very highest percentile of people who have stood out as not only tremendously empathic, tremendously ethical, but also tremendously scholarly. She actually did read, when I said, read the complete works of Freud this weekend. Raffaella came back having done so. And she takes this work very, very seriously indeed. And I think that's very admirable. I want to extend my warm congratulations to you, Raffaella. And I want to extend particular congratulations to two special visitors who are currently online with us from Italy. I hope you'll be able to understand my English. And these two people are known as Mama and Papa, Raffaella's parents. And I know the two of you will be very, very proud indeed to have made such a very special daughter. It's a real privilege to know your daughter and to work with her. She's a great clinician and a great colleague and citizen. I'll speak very briefly about my chapter, which is, I'm afraid to say, a very, very ugly chapter. Christina Perry, our publishing director, you mentioned, Christina, in your speech that you had first begun to collaborate with Raffaella by email in April of 2020 when you came on board, not long after the pandemic. And I'm glad that a good communication took place, because as you were speaking, I was reminded that it was in April of 2020 that a horrific incident took place here in the United Kingdom. A rail worker, you'll remember, a rail worker by the name of Belly Munjinga was spat upon by a man infected by COVID, obviously a very troubled person, and he infected this 47-year-old woman, and she died very shortly thereafter from being spat upon by a man with this coronavirus. And I couldn't imagine a more horrific story, but that really encapsulates what Raffaella has come to call primitive bodily communication. And it's very relevant to me because my chapter is a very detailed, very extensive case history of a patient with whom I worked literally decades and decades ago, who was referred for being a compulsive spitter. This was a very elderly person, a very brain-damaged person, alas, a very psychotic person, and a very traumatized person who never communicated in words, solely in spittle. And when our dear colleague, whom we'll hear from later, Dr. Valerie Sinison, first presented this case, I worked for Valerie back then as part of what used to be called the mental handicap team at the old Tavistock clinic. Nobody else wanted to take on this patient. I think had I not been young and naive, I may well not have taken on this patient as well. And I suppose nowadays in the post-COVID era, where one can literally be murdered by being spat upon, treating a compulsive spitter is not everybody's first ambition. But what I can tell you is that I worked with this person for nearly a decade in very intensive psychotherapy. And I'm pleased to say that together we managed to cure this individual of spitting compulsively. This was somebody who literally spat on other people 1,000 times per day on average. So I really had my own very ugly immersion in learning about the realities, the true realities of primitive bodily communication. So thank you, Valerie Sinison, for being such a great teacher and inspirer to me. And I think probably we will all have cases of primitive communication of one sort or another. And I really recommend this book very warmly because I think all of the chapters give us insight into how we might better handle these really unhandleable cases for which we are certainly not prepared in our trainings or in our own upbringings. So thank you to Raffaella Hilty for bringing this project together.
Wonderful. The next speaker we're going to hear from this evening is called Mark Linington. And Mark is an attachment-based psychoanalytic psychotherapist and also a member of the Bowlby Centre. He is the CEO and clinical director at the Clinic for Dissociative Studies and worked for several years as a psychotherapist in the NHS with people with intellectual disabilities who had experienced trauma. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And hello to everyone. It's good to see so many people interested in this sort of work. I'm very glad and honoured to be included in this book about potentially horrible and shocking body-based material in psychotherapy. I was thinking back from when I first began my work as a psychotherapist. I think I had as a central concern was for people who were seen as unsuitable for psychotherapeutic help. I was interested in how psychotherapy and how my psychotherapy in particular could be made more accessible to people who were seen as unreachable or unresponsive to help. And I think there are three sections in my chapter, really. The chapter responding to trauma-based communication. The first is really a consideration of the word primitive, and Raffaella was just alluding to some of the political issues around the word primitive, and I felt it was important to think about those before really beginning to think about describing the work. And then I present two pieces of work, one with a black woman with Down syndrome, who didn't use much verbal language at all to express herself and to try and communicate about the awful things that had been done to her. And then secondly, a reflection on some psychotherapy with a woman with DID and one of her key identities, and the overwhelming feelings they were experiencing and the body harming communication that they were engaged in. And I think both of these examples from the work that I've done show that really I still retain this political concern for including people who, in addition to the distress that comes from their trauma, their interpersonal trauma, also have to try and manage significant social discrimination. And following from this, I think I have a question of how we manage as psychotherapists to relate to people who, as a result of the trauma they've experienced, express themselves in ways that we find so horrifying that we have a strong inclination to either turn away from them or to reduce and objectify them. And I think it's a key issue for me, really, is how to not get caught up in that dehumanizing of the person that they've experienced so many times in their history. How does that come into the psychotherapy, and how do we manage it? I want to give a quote that's in the chapter from Harry Stack Sullivan from his book on the theory of the interpersonal theory of psychiatry in 1953, where he's talking about the feeling of horror. And he says this: "Horror is the uncanny emotion that all of you have known at least once, probably in your sleep. Horror is a simply paralyzing combination of what I like to call revulsion, a feeling of almost total desire to be elsewhere and away from all this sort of thing, coupled again with a great desire to vomit, and perhaps a tendency to have diarrhea and one thing and another. And at the same time, there is literally a sort of paralysis of everything, so that nothing really goes on except this awful, and if it can possibly be avoided, never to be repeated experience." And I think that says something about the the feeling certainly that I've had in the work with the people that I've described, of wanting to get away from things, of losing control of my own body. And I'm just interested in how I think about those experiences in myself. So as I've practiced psychotherapy for longer, I noticed that I've developed this sort of additional and complementary interest to my concern with inclusion. In the feelings of the psychotherapist in working with such people who've experienced terrible trauma and are struggling to make themselves understood. There can be many powerful feelings we experience in such work: horror, shame, despair, fear, and zeal, for example. And zeal I've taken from the work of Harold Searles, and the thinking of, there's something in this work about a sort of therapeutic zeal, a sort of tendency towards omnipotence. I suppose that might be something to do with. So I hope in my chapter I've made some helpful contribution to thinking about these feelings, understanding their relational meanings, and showing their usefulness to the work. And as other people have said, I really want to thank Raffaella for being so supportive in helping me get this chapter together and have it in the book. I feel really pleased with that. Thank you.
Salvatore Martini is our next speaker, who's going to talk to us about embodied countertransference and the process of unconscious somatic communication. Salvatore is a psychologist and Jungian analyst. He's the vice president of the Italian Association of Analytical Psychology, AIPA, and a member of the International Association of Analytical Psychology, where he also supervises trainee analysts. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Salvatore.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. It's a great honor for me. And I would like to thank Raffaella for including me in this marvelous book. So my chapter investigates the unconscious somatopsychic process of communication within the analytic dyad that occurs in the presence of phenomena of embodied countertransference. I have called it the process of unconscious somatic communication. And during my training at the AIPA, Italian Association of Analytical Psychology, I was always keenly aware that in order to practice and discover this profession, I would certainly have to face the painful thoughts and experiences of my patients and deal with my own psychological sufferings. However, I never imagined that these feelings could have often manifested in a physical and corporeal way, sometimes even in the form of acute physical pain. Due to the unconscious pressures deriving from strong defense mechanism manifested by some of my patients, I have frequently come into contact with the experience that Jung referred to as participation mystique, taking his cue from the anthropological studies of Lévi-Breuil, and I have therefore had the possibility to observe the varying ways it manifests during the therapeutic process. These can take the form of unpleasant and embarrassing bodily sensation, such as severe muscle tensions and physiological urges. Rosemary Gordon equated in 1965 in her contribution on the Journal of Analytical Psychology, participation mystique with the primitive defense mechanism of projective identification, elucidated for the first time by Melanie Klein in 1946, the same year in which Jung wrote The Psychology of the Transference. Projective identification can pass on vital information regarding the early onset and degree of severity of the patient's psychological damage, to say it with Anna Segal, above all when somatic reactions arise in analysis, in the analyst's body. The particular localization of these countertransferential phenomena in the analyst's body often seems to be symbolically connected to the patient's specific psychological problems. Projecting identification thus not only consists in an attempt to eject and repel unelaborated affective contents, but it also constitutes a persistent and chronic form of communication, according to Model, analogous, and I'm quoting, analogous to the physiological, to the automatic physiological defenses of the body. And it is an unconscious attempt to induce in the analyst the same suffering from which the patient suffers. And I'm quoting Martin Stone and his 2006 groundbreaking paper about embodied countertransference and about the analyst's body as the tuning fork, as a tuning fork. The analyst thus has the task of working upon his own, her or his own embodied countertransference to counteract the drastic mind-body splitting activating as a defense mechanism by the patient into an healthier mind-body integration. And this can help the patient to attain his psychosomatic integrity and gradually perceive and hopefully elaborate his or her internal sufferings. This primordial communication dimension, primitive dimension, where the body becomes the intermediary of the encounter, can lead to a possible activation of archetypal energies, which are active in the depth of the psyche. In this realm, defined by Schwartz-Salant, the third area, the same dynamic occurs that can be found in the primordial stages of the mother-child relationship, and Jung described as psychoid realm, as Raffaella pointed out previously, a level of the existence which cannot be directly represented, where instinct predominates, and where the somatic and the psychic spheres coexist in a substantial unity. And during his seminars on Nietzsche, Jung also refers to a sort of impulse, which is incarnated in the body, an impulse of the self towards individuation, saying that if this impulse is obstructed for any reasons, the self will tend to manifest in a dysfunctional manner by means of negative somatic symptoms. And he also describes the concepts of kinship libido, subtle body, and somatic unconscious, concept that I tried to elucidate in my chapter. Basically, I described how the analytical diet can enter this psychoid realm, starting from somatic reaction of the analyst as a manifestation of the split-off complexes of the patient, leading to a progressive transition from a complexal and personal level to an archetypal and collective level. And I described a specific clinical case, the clinical case of Emanuele, a hearing child of deaf parents, to illustrate how destabilizing the phenomena of embodied countertransference can be for the analyst. Nevertheless, I illustrated how the confusion associated with this phenomenon can provide the analyst with an opportunity for gaining an initial understanding of the patient's dissociative defensive mechanisms and for experiences the embodied suffering of the patient's somatopsychic malaise. The analytical couple thus enters a shared unconscious area, gaining access to archetypal and vivifying energies which are able to reactivate the patient's process of individuation. And from a Jungian perspective, we could also say that my experience of analysis with Emanuele further not only Emanuele's process of individuation, but also my own, as I feel that it encouraged me to embark upon an exciting and inspiring journey of professional and personal growth and maturation. I became involved in several stimulating and rewarding initiatives regarding the role of the body in analysis. And this chapter And my contribution to this wonderful book is an important example of this inspiring journey. And so thank you all very much, and special thanks to my patient, Emanuele. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvatore. So we have one final speaker before we move on to questions. And I was just thinking, I wonder if while we're listening to these wonderful speakers, if we might tune into our own bodies and see if that might inform the questions that we can bring at the end. Our last speaker today is Valerie Sinison, who always describes herself as a poet first, a poet, writer, and a retired child and adult psychoanalyst. And she's going to be talking to us about her chapter on working with primitive bodily communications in the context of unbearable trauma in non-verbal patients. So, Valerie, over to you.
Thank you. It's a real honour to be here and to be in this book, which is a really needed book because we find the subject unbearable. That as children who become adults, we somehow want to discard all the body awareness that came from us when small, that somehow we get used to having adult teeth instead of baby teeth. Thank heavens our arms don't have to fall out, but there is a psychological fallout of the things we found humorous, frightening, deep when we were little. And my way of first looking into this was the difference in status I had when I taught infants compared to when I taught college or university students. And I found that quite riveting in that the younger the group you work with, the more your work is denigrated. Similarly, the status difference with a child therapist and an adult psychoanalyst, that there was, again, a very big difference. And I was really struck by this. What was it that made the vital beginnings of life have far less significance, gravitas, status than when you were talking on the whole to people that were continent, regulated? And of course, there comes the next clue. If you're working with the incontinent, the very old, the very disabled, the status goes even when they're adults, because what the very old and the disabled and the babies and toddlers share is the fact of incontinence. And that somehow the role of disgust and shame in our upbringing and the nature of what kind of toilet training we've had, how it affects us, is a very deep one. I sort of started my chapter, I was remembering as an infant school teacher, taking children to the zoo for an outing. And there was this scene that had all the teachers and adults feeling sick, and the children absolutely riveted and laughing and enjoying it. And it was the chimpanzees defecating, holding their stool in one hand, picking it up and eating it in the other. And this was the highlight of the school year. And it sort of made me realize, which working with infants and junior school does, the whole significance of burps, farts, words linked to this that sort of seem rude, primitive, dirty, about earliest experiences. And what makes those experiences stop being fun, amusing, or, if you like, our omnipotent wish to have a fecal baby instead of the real one that we can't have unless we're an adult, that somehow it's thrown away, it's not allowed, it's rubbished by the environment so that whilst playing with plasticine and clay and sand have got sort of hints of that earlier exploration, it's all sublimated and hidden. I'm starting with the ordinary developmental side because what we find in trauma is that all these earliest experiences come out even more. And in concentration camps, depriving people of fecal autonomy is one of the first things that happen. I'm also finding in working with Ukrainian therapists who are supporting women who have been raped by the Russians that there is less fear of death, loss of attachment figures, buildings falling down, than the fear of being raped. And what that tells us about gender, fear of female bodies or the insides of them, why that could be such a terrifying prospect compared to all the other horrors that war brings. And of course, war, as the founder of the Save the Children Fund declared, wars are always against children, but it's starting the next new waves of trauma going. And in working with traumatized men, women, and children with or without a learning disability, we find, as Brett did so bravely, and as Mark has continued to do as well, we find that almost every bodily substance says hello in the consulting room and affects our countertransference in the most profound way, in that there are areas we won't be able to manage. When teaching infants, I got used to wiping up all sorts of messes, but the thing I couldn't bear was the children eating snot, and no amount of analysis made any difference. Apologies to anyone I'm making feel sick. What I'm wanting to emphasize is that when it comes to these primitive communications, we can't filter our responses, and some of them are just ours. And what I learned to say in therapy to the children and adults in the room was, I'm really sorry, this is me, not you, but I can't think about you when you do that. I'm sorry, here's a tissue. If you want me to think about you, please use this. Everything else I managed, but as I said, these are so deep, what we can and can't physically bear in the room, that no amount of therapy or hypnosis or EMDR or whatever our background is likely to change that. It was laid down so early. I'm not going to give some of the trauma examples that are in the book, and Ruth very carefully did say that I'd put a warning in for what things might disgust people. But if we consider someone that's been tortured, who has experienced the reenactment of every shamed body experience in their torturer that's been shoved into them because it's not bearable, we feel that in the interchange, in the consulting room. And it makes us even more aware of how precious and important it is to hold a baby with care and with love. Sometimes we can see a nipple shoved in a mouth or a bottle shoved in a mouth is the first oral rape that a human being has experienced when not done lovingly and thoughtfully, or where there's a fear of dirtiness from the way an adult's been treated that then gets projected into a child who sees the look of disgust in the parents on changing them or cleaning them. or the fact that until 20 years ago, children wetting the bed as a sign of pain were then beaten by teachers as an educational policy because of the unbearableness of considering what the child had gone through. So the only areas where I have been involved with touch in therapy, and Graham Galton, who wrote a very positive review of this book, in his book on touch, was looking at where did it work, where was it dangerous, and of course with abuse and vulnerability there needs to be consent. It's a very complicated issue, but where somebody has been made to swallow non-food substances, feels an object of disgust because of what's gone in their body, then I find holding out a hand nearby to show I will hold that and go near that. That's been one of those areas. So I would like to end with the beauty of the fact that with Zooms, even though we've all been wary of touch and communication, and Brett gave us a horrendous example of murder by spitting, it's meant that in cyberspace, there's been able to be connections that wouldn't otherwise have been made that help to make up for this. Speaking directly to Kyiv, speaking directly to people that have still got access to have a witness outside facing reenactments of one unworked through body trauma is a real sign of that. The last thing I want to say is that the attachment research in St. Petersburg, when I was there 5 years ago, at St. Petersburg University, 80% of the civilian population have a disorganized attachment, not a psychiatric hospital. The normal population, because of the siege, the war, and ongoing trauma. And we are watching the bodily reenactments in the poor young men we send out to be killed for their country on all sides. So thank you for your thinking, and sorry for any horror, because there is horror in thinking about this.
Thank you, Valerie. Can I just bring in a couple of these comments in the chat box? A couple of them. One, Leonora says, absolutely fantastic introduction and reminder of these primitive processes, which has helped me contextualize my bodily countertransference in sessions with certain clients this week. Will be buying the book and recommending to fellow child and adolescent psychotherapists. And Mahar says, congratulations to all contributors. I join you from Tehran, Iran, and I'm absolutely going to purchase a copy and introduce it to my colleagues here in Tehran. Wonderful. Do you want to make a final comment, Raffaella, before we bring proceedings to a close?
Well, I would like to say once again, it's been wonderful to be here with all of you today. And I feel so honored that I've been able to work with all the people who have contributed to the book. Once again, thank you so much for all the authors. Thank you for all the people who have joined us today. And I really hope that this book will inspire, it's not only about working with extreme forms of bodily expressions, but, there is a spectrum, no? And I hope this will really, inspire us as therapists as just, be open and really use our bodies and really allow ourselves to be really used in the room to help our clients. Yeah.
I'd just like to end by raising a glass or a cup or a glass of water, and just to wish this book so well, and may it sell millions of copies and everyone gain so much from it. It's very, very worthwhile. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.